on the eve of Austin Clarke's 90th birthday as we celebrate this landmark anniversary, as well as mark and reflect on the deep and abiding literary friendship shared between two pioneering writers, Austin Clarke and Andrew Salkey. So this is one of two events being convened this year to mark Austin Clarke's 90th year. The other event will be an in-person conference being convened on September 26th and 27th at McMaster University and Toronto Metropolitan University, where we're co-organizing this with my colleague, Darcy Ballantyne at TMU. So keep an eye out for further details regarding the upcoming conference in the fall. I would like to thank the McMaster University Library, the International Initiatives Microfund here at McMaster, the Office of the President, the McMaster Alumni Association, and of course our colleagues at the British Library for their support for today's event. At McMaster, we often start events with a land acknowledgement to show both respect to Indigenous peoples and to their enduring connection with the traditional territories and its histories. But we also see this as an important, if indeed incomplete, step in a process of reconciliation. I would like to take this opportunity to acknowledge that the land on which McMaster University stands is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peacefully share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. If you would like to learn more about the meaning of land to Indigenous people or the Dish with One Spoon Wampum agreement, we'll put in the chat some links for you to read and explore. Before we move forward, I'd also like to take some time to go over a few housekeeping items. This talk is being recorded and we will send out a link to the recording in about a week. This talk will also be archived on the McMaster alumni website. For accessibility needs, Zoom does offer a closed captioning feature. To activate it, please click where it says more at the bottom of your screen, then click live transcript, and this will enable a transcript. So thank you to those who submitted a question in advance during the registration process. We will also be taking live questions following the presentation. So if you have any questions, please enter those into the Q&A section by clicking on the Q&A icon on your screen. Please post your questions in this Q&A section and leave the chat for questions or issues related to tech aspects of the webinar, and our team will try to help you out if needed. So it seems very fitting that we would convene this as a transatlantic gathering and project to celebrate and reflect on the literary correspondence and friendship between Austin Clarke and Andrew Salkey. Salkey and Clarke were diasporic writers in the most essential sense of the term. Their biographies refuse easy nationalistic formulations and designations. Salkey was born in Panama in 1928 and grew up in Jamaica before moving to Britain in 1952 as part of what we now call the Windrush generation, a generation that fundamentally transformed British society and culture. And here at McMaster University over the last 2 years, I've been teaching a course titled Windrush Writing Windrush, Empire, Race, and Decolonization. And in some ways, the impetus for this project grows out of that work. In the 1960s, along with John LaRose and another Barbadian literary stalwart, Kamau Brathwaite, Salkey was one of the co-founders of the Caribbean Arts Movement, CAM, which became a central pillar for Caribbean cultural creativity in London. And in the 1970s, he moved to the US when he was offered a lifetime position as writer-in-residence at the Hampshire College. Clarke's life and trajectory is similarly transnational. He was born in Barbados in 1934 and grew up there before coming to Canada in 1955 to attend university. Like Salkey, Clarke's career spanned multiple fields, including literature, broadcast journalism, and teaching. In the period of the late 1960s and early 1970s alone, Clarke was visiting professor at several US universities, including Yale, Duke University, University of Texas at Austin. This was a time of important protests and significant upheavals across campuses, similar to those that we have witnessed across many university campuses in the last year. In 1973, Clarke was designated cultural attaché at the Barbadian Embassy in Washington, D.C., and in 1975, he was appointed as the general manager of the then fledgling Caribbean Broadcasting Corporation in Barbados, a post he held for 2 years before returning to Canada. Given their transnational trajectories, it is little wonder then that letters were a key part of how they animated and sustained their friendship. These letters are important documents that give us glimpses of their immediate worlds, but also broader political and social shifts and transformations. We see both men struggling with changes in society, their changing place in society, as well as with institutions, and indeed with each other. This is an important documentary archive spanning decades that gives us glimpses of happenings on both sides of the Atlantic. But it would be a mistake to approach these letters only as sources of information. They are also important and engaging for their style, and a lot can be said about the style of these letters. After all, these men were in fact writers, and we can see them grappling with narrative voice and register, but also with how to tell the stories that they want to share with each other on the page. Given the importance of letters to them personally and their understandings of letters as relational and narrative space, we can also understand why and how letters show up in their literary practice. And in Salkey's work, as well as Clarke's work, they showed a keen understanding of letters as ways of unfolding plot, outline, character, and creating empathy in their stories. We see this, for instance, in Salkey's novels, The Late Emancipation of Jerry Stover and Escape to an Autumn Pavement, where letters between friends, lovers, parents, and children recur. Similarly, we might read Clarke's short story, Letter of the Law of Black, as forged from this diasporic sensibility. Here, he uses a series of letters between father and son, two generations of Barbadian men, immigrants to Canada, offering reflections on surviving racism in the racism that was pervasive in Canadian society. Letters in their novels then are full of advice, gossip, caution, reflection, much like the actual letters that these writers wrote to each other. For today's webinar, archivists from the British Library and McMaster Library will talk about their work with these archives and with these letters. So joining us from the British Library is Helen Melody, who's lead curator of contemporary literary and creative archives at the British Library, where she looks after the literary and theatrical archives of writers, poets, playwrights, actors, and others, specifically those archives created in the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. She began at the library in 2008, cataloging the Ted Hughes archive. And she'll be joined in conversation by Myron Groover, who is McMaster University's Archives and Rare Books librarian. He read history at the University of Aberdeen and library archival studies at the University of British Columbia. His work focuses on collection development, curation, and teaching with archives and rare books. His academic interests includes book histories, the material culture of text, and the history of ideas. Our Q&A today will be moderated by Lindsay Corridon, who is a graduate student in the Department of English and Cultural Studies at McMaster, and who is also the research assistant for the Austin Clarke at 90 project. Lindsay is also a writer. He's the author of the poetry collection West of West Indian, which was published earlier this year. I will now turn over things to Myron and Helen.
Thank you, Ronald, for that very warm introduction. It's wonderful to be here today. Christine, I'm going to ask if you wouldn't mind to pull up our slides here. I use slides slightly as speaking notes to help me keep track of what I'm saying. So hopefully I'll be able to follow along with my own thoughts. Welcome everyone to this event, which, as Ronald mentions, is really kind of an inaugural effort right before what would have been Austin Clarke's 90th birthday, to celebrate this phenomenal friendship, this phenomenal literary body of archives. And I will start by talking a little bit about what I do and where I'm situated and where our half of this archival conversation is coming from. Next slide, please. So, as Ronald mentioned, my name is Myron Groover. I'm the Archives and Rare Books Librarian here at McMaster University Library. I work in the quadruple-barreled titled William Reedy Division of Archives and Research Collections. And this is a wonderful collection to work with. It's one of Canada's finest collections of archives and primary sources, comprising over 4 linear kilometers and growing all the time of archival records, archives being the inchoate, often unpublished records that tell the true story of human lives and human endeavors. So records of people, records of organizations, the personal papers of individuals, the manuscripts of literary figures, things like diaries, letters, often documents that were not intended for public consumption that we're now asking different questions of than they were originally intended to answer. And we also look after a collection of over 100,000 rare and significant books dating from what we might think of as the European Middle Ages all the way through to the present day. This collection has a number of particular strengths that I want to emphasize as we set the table for this conversation. One of our major collecting interests is actually Canadian literature and Canadian broadcasting. And it's through this collecting impulse and collecting initiative that we ended up in a conversation with Austin Clarke and his people about acquiring his papers. We're one of the world's largest collectors of records relating to Canadian authorship and publishing in general, on which more anon. We also have a phenomenal collection of early modern and 18th century books from the hand press era 30 or 40,000 such titles. We specialize in collecting books from the arts and crafts and private press movement in the United Kingdom in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And particularly germane to this event today, we have over the last 20 years or so started making a concerted effort to acquire Afro-Caribbean diaspora records and records of literatures emanating from these communities, especially those which have a tie to Canada. That's related to our collecting in political radicalism, in peace, pacifism, disarmament, labor history, and left organizing more generally. So a number of these themes come together in Austin Clarke's papers, which we'll talk about here presently. Next slide, please. So I wanted to set the stage by introducing some of these Afro-Caribbean collections in more detail, and you should consider this as a member of the audience an exhortation to come and make use of these records in your own learning, your own research, or your own teaching. As I mentioned, teaching is a major component of my role. One of the things that we're very proud of here at McMaster is working with people like Ronald, people like Lindsay, to mobilize collections like this in support, especially of undergraduate learning. So some of the more significant collections we have in this vein, of course, the Austin Clarke papers, which we'll be talking about today, which extend to 22.5 linear meters of material. You might wonder why we use this kind of crude brush of saying something is 22 linear meters. These archives can contain an astonishing proliferation of different types of document, different ways of conveying information, some of which, if we were granular about them, might not actually be particularly helpful. It's not super useful to tell a researcher, okay, it's 12 trillion pages that you're going to be looking at. Giving an idea that it occupies 22 linear meters on a shelf can help someone get an idea of how much time they need to get to grips with the collection. 22.5 linear meters from Austin Clarke's archives. Louise Bennett Coverley, affectionately known as Miss Lou, a major figure in Jamaican language revitalization and language activism in the 20th century. We have 9 linear meters of her records. We co-administer that archive with the National Library of Jamaica, which holds parts of her other records. We also hold the papers of Rachel Manley, who was the daughter of a 3-time Prime Minister of Jamaica and granddaughter of the founder of one of its major political parties, who's written a number of memoirs about her political life and career and family. And I'm very excited to report recently we acquired a collection of audio interviews by a Canadian journalist by the name of Neil Armstrong, who in the 80s and surrounding decades interviewed dozens and dozens of Black radical figures, both in Canada and the United States, providing really an incredible documentary record of the life and thought of Black thinkers at that time. Next slide, please. So, of course, today we are talking in particular about the archives of Austin Clarke. Now, I didn't know a huge amount about Canadian literature, I must admit, as a new Canadian before I started this job. And so I've actually had the rare pleasure of coming to know Austin Clarke first and primarily through the documentary legacy he left behind. I started reading his works after encountering him in his archives. This body of material is incredibly rich. It is wonderful to work with. It is very full-fleshed and gives a great sense of the life of this individual and the span of the intellectual concerns and engagements that he had over the course of his life. And as a new Canadian, I have been particularly intrigued to encounter in Clarke's papers some themes that new Canadians wrestle with to this day. Themes of alienation, themes of parochialism, of feeling that he has moved to a sort of a suffocating place, which is not hospitable to his voice, not hospitable to the type of literature he is trying to produce. And one of the amazing things about this life and this body of records is that for most of his career, Austin Clarke really was outside of the mold of what we consider to be Canadian literature as formally construed. He was not interested in its pieties. He was not interested particularly in adhering to its accepted contours. He exhibited a remarkable liberty of thought and a willingness to pursue his own voice and his own ideas, even when this was occasionally or often deeply frustrating to him. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to give a snapshot, and I appreciate that members of the audience probably won't be able to read these, which is why you have to explore this archive later, either in person or digitally, and we will be building an exhibit to accompany this event, so stay tuned for that. These are just some of the documents or the types of documents that you'll find in Austin Clarke's archives. On the left here, what you see is an actual publication contract for one of his novels with his inimitable penmanship, which is one of the real joys of working with this collection. He was essentially a calligrapher, and he wrote many things in this really beautiful kind of copperplate script. The second photo you're seeing here is from a series of articles that he wrote as a kind of we might think of this as gesturing toward clickbait. He wrote a series of articles on themes of Black liberation and race relations in Canada that were, by the standards of their time, especially in Canada, extremely radical. And he didn't publish these in a left-wing paper. These were run in the most right-wing conservative paper of the country to get ideas that were outrageous to its readership in front of them in the hope that they would keep reading. And so we have, for example, the original manuscripts of these columns with Austin Clarke's handwritten annotations. And with literary archives like this, it's really wonderful to see this kind of evidence of writers' process, writers coming back to their own works, shaping them. You see editorial interventions coming in. You can see authors pushing back on editorial interventions or accepting them. So that's one of the amazing things about this archive is it gives a real sense of the progression of his thought and work over time. Next slide, please. But to me, one of the most amazing things in this body of archival material is the section of the archive, which is many boxes in its own right, several linear meters, in fact, which deals with correspondence, which deals with Austin Clarke's letters, his letters to and from other individuals. And I wanted to take a moment and think about and build on Ronald's conception of a kind of transatlanticism in this correspondence, in this body of letters, this body of material we're considering today. By nature, prior to the advent of email, unless you made a special effort to keep a copy of your own outgoing correspondence, you would only have the incoming side of a story if you had a decades-long correspondence with another individual. And both Clarke and Salkey do not seem to particularly have been in the habit of keeping their own outgoing correspondence, which means to reconstruct this relationship, to reconstruct this discourse, we need to work together with our counterparts in this case at the British Library, because each of these men only had the words of the other in this correspondence. So if you were to visit archives of Austin Clarke, you would only find Andrew Salkey's incoming letters. There are very few of Austin's outgoing letters. And vice versa for Salkey's own papers, where you'll see Clarke's letters to Salkey, but not his replies. I think this is quite poignant in its own right because you have a conversation in two halves on either side of the Atlantic. And in Clarke's papers, you won't find any of Clarke's letters. This also kind of forces us to engage with this means of correspondence where things could take time. Letters would cross on their way over the Atlantic. By the time you've responded to something, someone might have, and in one case, in this curation that we've done, you might be responding a couple of letters ago. In one case, there's the two of them get into a little bit of a spat because there's a feeling that the correspondence is getting asymmetrical. And it turns out that several letters had actually crossed in transit, and it could have been a beef about nothing. So this conversation had to be reconstructed by my counterparts at the British Library and myself from both sides of the Atlantic. And I'd like to give an introduction and a sort of a taste and a sample of some of the letters that we've selected to discuss. So we're going to talk about these letters briefly today, and only a few of them in their highlights. Ronald is organizing a series of readings of these letters, which will be shared in due course after this event. And when the readings are done, we're going to be building a digital exhibit which showcase all of these letters, images of the original documents with transcriptions and links to video recorders of contemporary individuals reading these letters aloud and bringing them back to life through the spoken word. So let's just take a little bit of an exploration of some of the subject material here. Next slide, please. And I want to start with a couple of letters, and I can say this was a real privilege to get to kind of take the first crack at the curation of this material, because the folder of correspondence with Salkey that I started working with contains hundreds and hundreds of letters. And I was at real danger of getting so sucked into reading the letters that it was impossible to do curation because they're so fun to read. They're such an enjoyable read, and you get such a sense of the personality behind them. So it was really challenging to choose just 5 or 6. But here we see a sort of first glimpse at a couple of these letters. Again, appreciating that you probably won't be able to read these at home. I have some notes and highlights from these. What we're looking at here is an exchange of correspondence related to the enormous protests which convulsed the campus of Yale University in 1970 in response to the FBI's overt persecution of members of the Black Panther Party. There were a huge series of protests at Yale. The university welcomed the protesters with comparatively open arms, and this happened to be a time period when Austin Clarke was a visiting scholar at Yale, actually helping to establish one of the first Black Studies programs at that august institution. And so he was on the ground when this was happening, and he writes his impressions of these protests to his friend Andrew in the United Kingdom. And Austin's letter is a powerhouse of lyricism. He's deeply impressed that Yale has opened its arms to the protesters. He's confused by the comparative peacefulness of the protests. But he says in this letter that he's kind of disabused by this, of the notion that Yale is solely some kind of stick in the mud institution only capable of reinforcing existing structures. He kind of says that his mind has been blown by Yale becoming a nexus of radicalism in this way. Salkey replies, and he has this almost a sense of detachment in his reply. But he also has this amazing turn of phrase in his reply, where he says he's all for twisting things out of shape and coming up with a brand new something all around the world, but more so in our Caribbean, Black America and Canada, Black South America, Black Africa, and wherever Black people are. This exchange gives such a sense of eyes being open, such a sense of hope, such a palpable sense of belief that things not only can change, but are changing. And I think that can be a little bit difficult to sit with when we look at the trajectory of politics over the last several decades. But it's amazing to see these two individuals looking at these seismic events with such fresh and, in many cases, hopeful eyes. So I encourage you to read these two letters when they come out on the exhibit. I want to move on and talk about one more pair of letters, illustrating a kind of a different side of their relationship. This exchange here is quite intellectual in nature. They're close, but they're talking about the world of ideas, the world of great figures and great events shaping the world. Here we have a very different set of letters, occasioned on Christmas Day in 1971. Austin Clarke writes a letter to Andrew Salkey, which he prefaces by saying, I'm writing this at 4 a.m. on Christmas morning. And he writes to Salkey, and he says, "My brother, I am here in my study, sitting down among books, papers, manuscripts, informed thoughts, with a cup of tea, smoking my favorite pipe, thinking of you. Thinking about you in that cold motherland, myself in this cold motherland, early, early one Christmas morning. How are you, man? And how is your Christmas?" See this beautiful moment of someone at 4 o'clock in the morning on Christmas Day thinking of a distant friend and taking the time to set pen to paper and to conjure this kind of tone poem of where he is and what he's experiencing and why he's felt the need to reach out to his self-described brother in this way. You can see here his penmanship as well. And Salkey responds, and he responds in this very lyrical and beautiful way. And he says, "What a beautiful and thoughtful Christmas letter, old man. It had the presence and feel of your room, time of morning, mood of the writer, everything locked deep into it. So very lonely and loving when a brother remembers another at such a time of blissful day and sends his greetings the way you did. And 4 a.m., 25th December 1971, is a touching opening." And he says later in the letter, giving an insight into his own domestic life and what it's like to be in what Austin describes as the cold motherland of Britain. He says, "Of course, pressuring hard against the family health is the stark, cold northern reality of life over here with its weak prospects of all kinds. I look at our two boys and wonder and wonder and wonder. Anyway, they're both sensitive to the imbalances, prejudices, and brutalities all over. Television, newspapers, daddy's concerns sort of add up to a dawning awareness in them. Fuck Santa, we're in the world." And I think at this point, I will pass things over to my counterpoint at the British Library. Just wanted to give a little bit of a feeling of the sense of this correspondence and its significance. And as I say, please stay tuned because we'll be doing more to explore this correspondence and letters as we move forward. Helen, over to you.
Thank you, Myron, and hi, hello from London. As Ronald said, my name is Helen Melody. I am lead curator of contemporary literary and creative archives at the British Library. I'm going to begin with just a little bit of information about the library in case you've not been. We are a legal deposit library. We're also a national library. As a legal deposit library, we are publishers are required to give us a copy of every book that they publish. So as you can imagine, we have a very large collection. We have over 170 million collection items. So that includes printed books, antiquarian books, but also audiovisual and archival collections, which go from very ancient early periods right through to the present day. And as Ronald said, I have that particular contemporary focus. So we collect the writers of literary and theatrical creative people. So writers, poets, playwrights, actors. I've listed just a couple of examples here. But we really have a good what we try to do is to collect significant named individuals, but also people who demonstrate particular movements. So maybe who are less significant as individuals themselves, but are sort of their work is part of a wider shift or move within literature of the period. And if I can have the next slide, please, that would be wonderful. Thank you. So within our collection, similar, I think, to McMaster, we have a growing body of material which relates to Black, British and Caribbean diasporic literary collections. I'm going to talk a bit about Andrew Salkey in a minute, so I won't give him too much of my time now, but I just wanted to highlight a few other examples for people who might be interested. We have the archive of the Jamaican poet and writer James Berry, and Berry's wrote for both children and adults. He published a number of collections in his lifetime. Some of his best known are Bluefoot Traveller, which he published in 1976, and then Windrush Songs in 2007. We have the archive of the Guyanese teacher, writer, and ethnopsychotherapist, Beryl Gilroy, and it's a fascinating archive. Gilroy is best known for her memoir Black Teacher, which is sometimes compared and contrasted with the To Sir with Love, written by E.R. Braithwaite, who was also Guyanese. She really deals with intergenerational trauma, and that is something that she saw in her role as a teacher, in the children that she taught and in their families, but also something she grappled with in her novels. So it's very interesting. We have the archive of Andrea Levy too, so the child of Jamaican immigrants, born and bred in North London. She wrote a number of novels, which often took autobiographical experiences as a kind of basis. She wrote Small Island, perhaps one of her best-known works, in 2004, and Long Song in 2011. And the final one I've mentioned here is for Wasifiri magazine. So this is a contemporary literary, international literary magazine, which has different issues related to different subjects and different geographical regions. So if I can have my next slide, please. Thank you. So here we have the man himself, Andrew Salkey. As Ronald has said, born in Panama to Jamaican parents, spent his youth in Jamaica before moving to Britain in 1952. Again, I don't want to repeat too much of what's already been said, but he definitely had this movement, this diasporic, movement within his lifetime. It was hard to pin down in any one place. Salkey, I think, is interesting. What we find with our collections is writers tend to travel for different reasons. Salkey very much came as a university student, but it kind of contrasts sometimes with people who came to Britain for reasons of economic migration. Salkey, I think, is interesting because he managed through his role and his very nurturing kind of relationship with others to be very much a conduit between both these worlds. So he would have known those people who'd come over studying, but he would have also known people who'd come for more economic reasons to Britain. And indeed, Salkey's first contribution to the BBC radio broadcast series Caribbean Voices was actually in 1948, before he came to the UK. So he's really a Renaissance man. I organised a conference some years ago with a colleague, and we subtitled it Andrew Salkey, a man of many hats, because it was really hard to know where to place him. He was a writer and a poet. He was a broadcaster and a journalist. He was an activist and a campaigner. And I think if you know him, you would understand that the whole of his archive is coloured by, reflects on his political beliefs, his social kind of agenda, the feelings that he had, and you can see that in everything that he did. I'm also going to say here that he's a correspondent. As Myron has said, letters are important. They connect us to each other. They help us to find relationships, and especially they connect people when geography has split them up. Interestingly as well, Sam Selvon once referred to Salkey as the unofficial archivist of the Caribbean artist movement. As we've heard already, he was one of the founding members, and he was very much a keeper of things, a keeper of ephemeral things, a keeper of correspondence, which is both interesting for archivists, but sometimes challenging. And I think can be challenging if that's a member of your family and you have to encourage them to downsize. Luckily, that didn't happen for Salkey, though, and his archive is incredibly rich. He was also instrumental in Black British publishing. He worked closely with Jessica and Eric Huntley before moving to the US to teach at Hampshire College in 1976. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So I'm afraid I couldn't work out our linear meters, so I've had to just give you some file numbers here. But Salkey's archive contains almost 600 archive files arranged into 15 series. I'm just going to read them here to give you a sense of what we have, but we have a wide range of his different literary outputs, the novels, poems, short stories, and anthologies. We also have files relating to his work for the BBC. He was a freelance journalist for many years for the BBC and interviewed a wide range of different individuals. We have files relating to his time at Hampshire College. We have his Correspondence, which is his single largest series, and actually, interestingly, Clarke is the single largest correspondent within his largest series. We also have personal papers, examples of other people's writings, the ephemeral material I mentioned, photographs, and a wide range of printed sources. And actually for us, Salkey's archive has been incredibly useful for exhibition purposes because he often kept things which because of their ephemeral nature, you wouldn't find elsewhere: leaflets, brochures, things about protests, photographs, things that really help to enrich and bring things to life for an audience. So, what does the archive tell us about Salkey? I think really the sense I got when I first started working with the archive was the depth and breadth of material it contains, both in terms of what it tells us about him, but also the people around him. So when we acquire collections, I'm always very keen to understand what kind of insight it gives us into the creative process of the individual. That's what we want. We want to see that textual analysis. Well, we want to do the textual analysis, but we want to see the presence of someone's thoughts. The archive helps us to understand Salkey's influences and definitely his interests. As I said, the kind of political agenda that he had suffuses everything he did. His correspondence enables us to map his friendships, understand those divisions, those movements around the globe, and the interconnections that he had. Salkey, in his role at the BBC, was very well connected. He was also used those connections in order to help people around him, his friends, but also contemporaries and people he didn't know about well at all, to make connections with other people. He was almost like a networker. He was sometimes described as this kind of a Nancy figure in the middle of the London diasporic scene, kind of helping to interconnect everyone. This is both a good thing and makes life tricky for him, I think. The sense I get from reading some of his correspondence, not just Clarke's, but generally, is that Salkey was incredibly kind. He was incredibly generous with his time. He was generous in terms of the encouragement he gave and the time he must have spent writing the letters. As Myron said, these are letters of a writer. These are letters which are beautifully lyrical in places, sometimes annoyed, sometimes happy, sometimes melancholic, but always very well written. Salkey, and I believe it's the same with Clarke, also had a kind of agony uncle figure, in that they were agony uncles for people. So people would write to Salkey and would often give him a very full picture of the difficulties they were facing, and he would, I imagine, obviously we don't have his response, he would respond to them. So I think there must have been a certain emotional burden to being that prolific a writer because of all the time it took away from his own writing, but also the emotions involved and the amount of time that he spent really considering other people's feelings when he was directing these responses. So I'm going to move on to my last slide, please. Thank you very much. And I just wanted to give, again, another couple of examples of letters from here that I think help us to get a sense of Clarke and Salkey as two individuals. So what we have here is, again, something that Ronald touched on, which is Clarke becoming the general manager at CBC in 1975. And what I just want to point out, which is a bit of a boring archivist fact, but I think is interesting, is that Clarke's letter, beautiful, dated, timed, and everything. Salkey's letter doesn't have a date. We can guess it's from 1975 because that was when Clarke got this role, but it doesn't. And it's interesting here because his letter, to me, it's hard to judge at this size, but looks like a press release. He's written this kind of almost like a sort of press story, in which he congratulates Clarke. In fact, he teases him. He says, "Clarke, how could you not tell me directly that you've got this role?" But then he goes on to offer him my wholehearted congratulations on your new job. He's very encouraging to Clarke. He is obviously very genuinely happy for his friend to have got this role, and he encourages him wholeheartedly to really shape the CBC, make it something for Barbados, for Barbadians, and he tells him to always do the greatest good for the greatest number, which I think again is very reflective of Salkey's own personal political beliefs. He encourages him to seek to reflect everyone's interests and not just the views and interests of the middle class audiences. And he ends with a very Salkey-esque phrase, "Keep on keeping on, one love and Venceremos," which is obviously the title of our talk today. Clarke, in his response, is enthusiastic too, very much welcoming Salkey's congratulations. And he writes of the challenges he faces when he says, "All the chaps here have been trained in Britain at the BBC, and this has given them a neo-colonialist approach to broadcasting and to themselves." Though it seems it's generally a positive thing, as he writes at the end, "However, I am making progress." I think the archives that we have, the letters that we have, can only really give us a sense of what the friendship between the two men must have been like, but it's clearly strong and it's personal. And I think I always feel like this as an archivist, it's a real gift and a real pleasure to be able to get these insights into people. And it's only by working together that we can really draw together the two sides of a correspondence and get this amazing sense of what was really happening, and perhaps glean and maybe draw some conclusions for ourselves about what we can learn about these two amazing figures. So thank you very much.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to jump in and say thank you to all of the panelists for contributing this morning. We have approximately 10 to 15 minutes, I want to say, for questions. So I'm just going to ask once more that if you do have a question for us, please drop it in the Q&A box that is at the bottom of this Zoom webinar screen. We have pre-submitted questions as well, so I'm going to start with those, and hopefully we will get more questions as we move along. So we have the first pre-submitted question from Kelly Josephs. Thank you for your question, Kelly. And Kelly asks, are there any mentions of Edward Brathwaite and or the Caribbean artist movement or Safaku in the letters?
Do you want me to start? I can. I'm not sure about specifically among the correspondence between these two men, but there definitely will be within Salkey's wider correspondence. I'm sure there will be. There definitely is about the Caribbean artist movement, and Salkey's letters. I guess this is the case with all these figures where everyone's really far apart. But they're quite gossipy about each other as well. So there'll be lots of references to each other. And do you know what happened to this person? And I know where he is. And because obviously, as well as not always hearing from each other because of posts getting lost and things taking longer, they were also interconnecting with each other. So I think it's fair to say that definitely the correspondence will kind of interconnect, because as you do now, you talk about your friends. So there's lots of interconnections, but it's with our collection, we don't tend to catalogue correspondence to the degree of talking about subjects. So sometimes researchers have to do a bit more digging to find those references.
Thank you, Helen. I'll follow on from maybe our side of this question. Certainly we do. We actually have a folder, at least one folder of letters from Brathwaite in Austin Clarke's archives. As Helen says, sometimes you need to read widely and deeply to glean and pull out some of these threads that you're looking for. And in particular, as Helen was speaking, I was struck by some of the letters that I was reading and bear in mind, I was reading Salkey's side of the letters as we were kind of approaching this curatorial exercise. And I was amazed at the conversational and, as Helen says, almost gossipy tone. So one of the first letters that I picked, Salkey is writing about V.S. Naipaul's early efforts and Salkey's encouragement of Naipaul and his literary undertakings. So yes, if you do a directed search, you will certainly find things of that nature in these archives, but you might also find serendipitously more than you're looking for elsewhere in the correspondence. That's one of the beauties of these sorts of bodies of correspondence, is that you occasionally find things that you weren't looking for, and sometimes they're the most useful of all.
I will add, Kelly, in one of the letters that will be sort of publicized in the coming days during the recordings, Andrew is pissed at Clarke for sort of Clarke demanding that he write more frequently, but also more lengthy letters. And he directly sort of refers to the tasks that he has to sort of address every day. And one of the tasks he does highlight angrily is all of the letters and correspondence that he also has to do for Caribbean artist movements. So there are moments where these instances do pop up.
And that, I gotta say, that's actually one of my favorite letters, because he just becomes so outraged, because Austin Clarke kind of, sends him a letter being like, oh, maybe you're not taking as much time as you should be on this correspondence. And he gets back like a 4-pager being like, do you have any idea how much time I spend on correspondence every day? Do you have any idea how lucky you are to get as many letters from me as you do? Bro, I'm not neglecting you. Let me just give you a snapshot into how many letters I just had to send on this one day. So it's a really cool letter to read. It's a lot of fun. And then Austin writes back, he's kind of like, oh, chill out, bro, everything's fine.
I mean, maybe one thing to add in terms of that letter, one of the things that struck me was that Salkey was not only writing to folks within the Anglo-Caribbean diaspora, he was also writing to folks based in other linguistic areas. And of course, like we can know some of that because he wrote Havana Journal about his travels to Cuba. So he was corresponding with people across a range of spaces. And I think that's one of the fascinating things about, these lectures in terms of like the mappings of diaspora that they offer us.
We have a few questions rolling in now, so I'm just going to try to move as quickly along as possible. So there is one question from Patricia Kumper. It says, any mention of the women who were part of CAM or writing in the archives?
I'm not sure particularly in relation to CAM, but I know in the Salkey archive more generally, not just in his correspondence, he writes specifically about supporting different women. So he was friends with and supportive of Beryl Gilroy, who I spoke about earlier, and he writes, I think in such a way you can't remember where. I think in one of the diaries, he writes something about how he supports the women, but he knows the other brothers won't like it. So he's aware, and like everybody, you're like one person with one group of friends and sort of like another person with another group of friends. And I think Salkey kind of typifies that. So he's aware that by supporting women such as Beryl Gilroy, he's quite different to some of his contemporaries. So I'm not sure how much that's in the Caribbean artist movement related papers we have in his archive, but again, it's in his correspondence, that kind of sense of who he's talking to, and just the sheer number of letters he receives from women demonstrates something about his kind of support of that.
I would say there is also a lot of reflection of women writers in Clarke's archives, and we have to also remember that Clarke was a teacher. He taught literature, he taught prose composition to a lot of people. So he has a lot of records of letters with his students, with people who he has an educational relationship with, who he's trying to bring up in a community of writers. So yes, certainly there's correspondence with established writers, but I would encourage scholars to not neglect some of the correspondence with students and people who maybe were not yet established as well. It's certainly an element of Clarke's life that was really important to him.
As well as editors and publishers. I mean, Margaret Busby is a name that comes up a lot in these papers as well.
We have a question from Rita Joseph Olivetti, and Rita asks, any mention of Edgar Mittelholzer in either of these archives?
We have a file of correspondence from Mittelholzer in the Salkey archive, and I believe there will be definitely references to him, especially around his death. I know into the kind of a correspondence of many of the friends of the two men. So definitely in the Salkey archive.
I don't see a specific file in Clarke's correspondence. That being said, it's not unlikely that you're going to see peripheral mentions. I did find, while idly control-Fing it, that there's a file related to J. Edgar Hoover that now, as soon as this is over, I'm going to go read because I really want to know what Austin Clarke kept a file on J. Edgar Hoover about. So watch this space.
I apologize, but this person's name is iPhone3. iPhone3 asks, in the age of communications through email, how do the archives respond to the transformation of correspondences?
Helen, do you want to take a stab at this first, or shall I?
Yeah. Well, I can have a go. So we do have Salkey's archive does not really contain a lot of what we call born digital material. We do have archives that do, and it is challenging, I can't lie. Especially, in fact, I think the correspondence side is more challenging than the literary kind of papers, because it's how you make it available. So we've acquired some of these collections, but we haven't yet found a mechanism to make them available kind of beyond sort of sample sizing of them. Because, for example, if you know your own email inbox, it's huge, right? You don't have to be, unless you're an incredibly aggressive deleter of emails, most people's email is quite big. I think emails are really fascinating. They have the immediacy of a Victorian letter. You send an email, you expect a response. you're upset if someone doesn't respond to you. But what I would say is that they're challenging, but I'd like to think they're not going to be impossible. I think though researchers still love the immediacy of holding the thing that was held by the person who sent it. And that's the thing that's more challenging to replicate digitally.
I agree. It is a challenge. We have also acquired a number of, again, Clarke's is not one such. There's not a huge amount of electronic material in this particular archive, but we have acquired and are acquiring more of archives which do contain or even are primarily born digital and which have a lot of email in them. And as Helen says, it's really challenging to pull the kind of contextual nature of a correspondence out of email. I mean, as she says, think about your own Gmail, how hard, like if you have a Gmail account, how hard it is to even follow your own correspondence with one person over years through that medium. It could be really, really frustrating. And one of the things that I think it's important to kind of emphasize when we talk about digital preservation is, and forgive me, this seems facetious, but this is really important intellectually speaking. These are not records which are human readable in the sense that we understand that term. We're not just preserving these words or graphemes or texts. We also are needing to engage with all of the layers of technological mediation that are between the keyboard and the eye of the reader. And that's a lot of layers. Many of them are also inherently proprietary and owned by private corporations that don't have a huge vested interest in permitting people to reverse engineer their kind of walled ecosystems of intellectual property. So even when we do try, and we do, to preserve digital formats and digital data, we often have to ask ourselves really difficult theoretical questions about what can actually be preserved and how we can responsibly display this kind of content, knowing that the user is not going to experience it in the same medium that its original intended audience did. And that's really, really different from letters, because when you're holding one of these letters, you are physically holding the artifact that was received by one of the two correspondents. It's not only unmediated, you're looking directly at the same thing. So yes, email is certainly being preserved, but it is a real challenge of scope, scale, and mediation. And I think even the most well-resourced archives have not yet quite cracked the kernel of the problem, which is how to actually share this kind of correspondence with other people in a way that makes sense.
Daniel Coleman says, thanks all for this fascinating discussion of Clarke and Salkey's correspondence. It's so intriguing. Both writers were prolific letter writers, and both Myron and Helen talked about the compelling nature of their mastery of this genre of writing. I'm wondering about your sense of epistolary exchange as a diasporic genre, both how diasporic life generated the conditions for the emergence of letters as an art form, but also the genre of letters informing us about the nature of diaspora itself. Would any of you on the panel be interested to speak to diaspora and letters as an art form? Thank you, Daniel.
Ronald, I may be tempted to tap you for this one.
It's a great question. I mean, and there are many ways in which one could attempt to answer it. One of the things, so the question of the diasporic genre is one, and I think there are like fascinating moments and letters where, like Clarke writes to Salkey at the start of the summer, and he's trying to figure out where he'll be throughout the summer, like, will you be in London? Will you be in Paris? Will you be traveling somewhere else, right? So there are these ways in which, like, you can see them trying to figure out where people are at different moments. And then, of course, when Clarke goes to the Caribbean, right? We like there is something about place and address, I'm suggesting, that is part of these letters. But I think for me, one of the things that fascinates me most is voice. I mean, the way they greet each other, brother Andrew, the way they sign off these letters, one love and Venceremos, like there is something of a kind of intimacy that is conjured through these greetings that frame the narratives that they share in these letters. One thing I will say is that these stories these letters were largely about telling stories. I mean, they're telling what's happening, sort of some of the mundane things that happen in their lives, but also we begin to see different parts of larger historic events being filtered through the stories that they tell in these letters. But I think part of it is in this exchange between them, it's also a writer writing to another writer, and you see them experimenting with voice. You see them trying out things in how they phrase things that I do think turn up in some of their fiction. That those practices aren't separate, and I think that there's a kind of exploration of skill, of writing skill, of engaging narrative voice that writers can do when they're writing to other writers in this particular form of the letter that is fascinating to encounter.
We have one final question from Christelle Twombly-Moll, and Christelle asks, I know that food was a topic of Austin Clarke that he often wrote about, whether it was drawing out the importance of food in relation to diasporic identity in his literature, to also publishing a food memoir or cookbook. Is there any food-related content in his archives?
I love this question because I'm also obsessed with food, so I'm super happy that someone asked this. Thank you so much for asking. And the answer is yes. Not only do we have, for example, you mentioned his culinary memoir. So we have a folder that's listed as holograph recipes, which is a fancy word that archivists use to mean something written by hand. So we have a series of his handwritten recipes that he used in the compilation of that culinary memoir. Also, the theme of food and the theme of culinary belonging comes up constantly in his correspondence. In fact, there's one turn of phrase, even from this little subset of letters. I can't remember which one it was, but Clarke writes to Salkey that he's relocating because he was perpetually on the move. He was doing visiting professorships here, there, everywhere. And coming back to that theme of diaspora, that's something they correspond about a lot. Like, where are you right now? Will you be able to host me? Like, you've never hosted me, but so-and-so did. So their place is really present in these conversations. But in one of the letters where Clarke indicates like he's relocating, he's going back to Toronto, he says he's packing up his chair and skillet and moving back to Toronto. And the skillet is one of the artifacts that he associates specifically with kind of like migratory domesticity in this sense. This is one of the things I'm taking with me: the chair, the skillet, and me. Like, we're going back. So food is kind of suffused, I would say, throughout this correspondence in different ways. Great question.
I think this is a great note for us to close the Q&A session on, by the way. Like, I do remember as well, like Clarke mentioning self a lot in a lot of the letters we're working with. So you learn a lot about food and his relationship to it just through the informal letter writing as well. Ronald?
Yeah, I mean, thanks to everyone for attending today. Thanks to Helen and Myron and Lindsay for this fascinating conversation. Just a couple of things to mention. Over 5 days in the upcoming week, so tomorrow, Friday, and then between Monday and Thursday, we'll be sharing bits from our curation. So in a kind of way, you'll see something of the curation in progress. So we'll be sharing some of these letters via Twitter. And again, this is a collaborative effort, so it will be shared via social media, through McMaster's Twitter, McMaster University Library's Twitter, as well as the Journal of West Indian Literature, as well as Small Axe Salon. We'll all be partnering to share bits of this correspondence. So we'll begin sharing stuff tomorrow on Austin Clarke's birthday, and then on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, culminating on Emancipation Day, we'll be sharing bits from this archive. And then at some point later in the summer, a fully curated version of this will be up and available for people to consult and use and reflect on. So we'll be sharing our curation in progress, so you'll get to see something of the process of us coming to this exhibition. And also to remind folks that there will be a conference later in the fall, September 26th and 27th. Details will be emerging. We're still accepting abstracts for the conference, so if you're interested in writing something about Austin Clarke, I encourage you to do so. Thanks to everyone for attending, and maybe have a glass of something in celebration of Austin Clarke tomorrow.